It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. That is how it begins. But before you even process the impossibility of that 13th strike, you feel the wind, a vile, biting wind that forces you to bury your chin into your breast. You smell the boiled cabbage. You step on the old, rotting rag mats. You are trapped in a world stripped of warmth. This is the suffocating, bleak architecture of 1984, the definitive dystopian novel of the 20th century, and its architect, George Orwell. Bleak was not merely writing a story, he was drafting a prophecy, a psychological blueprint of human destruction. We are dropped into Airstrip One, formerly London Tomals, a decaying province of Oceania. Oceania is one of 3 perpetually warring superstates, side, locked in a grinding stalemate with Eurasia and Eastasia. But the war outside is nothing compared to the war within. Here, the totalitarian apparatus known simply as the party exercises absolute, unchecked control. They do not just rule the streets or the economy, they rule history, they rule language. They govern the very concept of objective reality. To survive in Airstrip One is to live within a state of total, paralyzing paranoia. The panopticon is not a prison you can see. It is the telescreen on your wall, a device that receives and transmits simultaneously. You can be heard, you can be seen at any given moment. There is no way of knowing if the thought police are watching you right now. So you learn to live on the assumption that every sound you make is overheard, and except in absolute darkness, every movement is scrutinized. The gaze of the state becomes internalized. You become your own jailer. And above it all hangs the core paradox of this nightmare, plastered on towering white pyramids of concrete. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. To read those words is to feel a physical violence against your own mind. It demands staggering cognitive dissonance to accept this slogan, yet the citizens of Oceania must swallow it whole. They must actively participate in the murder of their own logic. This murder is overseen by the ultimate psychological deity, Big Brother. His face is on every corner, every coin, every stamp, the dark eyes that follow you around the room. We never truly know if Big Brother is a living, breathing man. It does not matter. He is a perfectly engineered phantom, designed by the party to channel the fundamental human need for reverence, while simultaneously weaponizing primal terror. He is the father who loves you, and the God who will obliterate you. Beneath him lies a rigid, inescapable caste system. There is the inner party, the untouchable architects of this misery. There are the proles, the massive, ignored underclass, left to wallow in poverty and cheap entertainment, and trapped between them is the outer party. Orwell argues that this middle class suffers the most acute existential dread. They are smart enough to understand the machine, but too powerless to stop it. They are the ones whose minds are policed with surgical, ruthless efficiency. The most terrifying weapon in this policing is not a gun or a torture rack. It is a dictionary. It is Newspeak. Newspeak is the only language in the world whose vocabulary gets smaller every year. The philosophical horror here is profound. The party is deliberately shrinking the range of human consciousness. If you eliminate the word for freedom, Michon, how can you ever conceptualize rebellion? You cannot. Heterodox thought becomes literally impossible because the words needed to form the thought no longer exist. The human mind is being boxed into a corner, walled off by silence. This brings us to our protagonist, Winston Smith. He is 39, frail, entirely unremarkable. When we meet Winston, we do not meet a traditional hero. We meet a man rotting from the inside out. He suffers from violent coughing fits in the morning. He drags a festering varicose ulcer above his right ankle. These are not just physical ailments, they are visceral, psychosomatic manifestations of his deeply repressed psychological decay. Winston's soul is dying, and his body is breaking down under the unbearable weight of carrying a mind that secretly hates the party. Yet the agonizing birth of his fatal rebellion does not begin with an explosion or a grand speech. It begins with a tiny, almost invisible crossing of the threshold. It begins in an alcove in his apartment, just out of sight of the telescreen. It begins with the purchasing of a blank, antique diary with smooth, cream-colored paper. Winston dips a pen into an inkwell. The physical act of writing, of pulling a thought out of his isolated mind and making it real on the page, is a death sentence, and he knows it. He forms the letters. The pen scratches. The nightmare has begun. The moment that pen scratches across the cream-colored paper, the nightmare has indeed begun. Winston Smith does not merely break a law in that dim alcove. He commits the ultimate, unforgivable sin of Oceania. He commits thought crime. The party does not just police your physical actions, they aggressively criminalize the subconscious mind. Every involuntary twitch, a muttered word in your sleep, a fleeting facial expression failing to mask internal misery, what they formally classify as face crime, is a potential death sentence. But Winston understands something far more terrifying about his quiet defiance. As he writes in his diary, the realization settles over his trembling shoulders like a heavy shroud. Thought crime does not entail death. Thought crime is death. The existential fatalism of this truth is absolute. The moment he allowed his mind to form a rebellious thought, his execution became conceptually predetermined. He is already a walking corpse, simply waiting for the physical world to catch up to his inevitable destruction. Yet, by day, this walking ghost must actively participate in the very machinery of his own psychological obliteration. Winston works in the sprawling, windowless pyramid of the Ministry of Truth. His daily soul-eroding labor involves forging historical documents, altering newspaper clippings to match the party's entirely fabricated narrative. It is institutionalized gaslighting on a macroscopic scale. When a fact becomes politically inconvenient, it is casually dropped into the memory hole, a pneumatic tube leading to a furnace that consumes the past, turning objective truth into ash. George Orwell understood a chilling reality. Erasing history intentionally leaves individuals entirely adrift. If you cannot remember yesterday, you cannot anchor your own identity. You lose the baseline of reality, fostering absolute, desperate reliance on the state to tell you who you are and what you have lived through. To survive this daily psychic violence requires a profound, unnatural mental surrender. It requires doublethink. This is the exhausting cognitive gymnastics needed to hold two mutually contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accept them both as absolute truth. The party demands that you know a fact is demonstrably false, but also genuinely believe it to be entirely true. It is the ultimate subjugation of human logic. The party's philosophical architecture is laid bare in a single terrifying maxim. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. This is not a distant, abstract terror. It is a dark, unyielding mirror, held up to our own modern anxieties regarding mass media manipulation and historical revisionism. If reality exists only in the mind and the party controls the mind, reality is whatever the party dictates. In the face of this overwhelming madness, Winston Smith is entirely alone. His isolation is profound, thick enough to choke on. He walks the ruined streets of London, believing he might be the very last sane man left on earth. This utter loneliness amplifies his vulnerability, making his fragile ego a prime target for despair. He cannot trust his neighbors. He certainly cannot trust children. The party weaponized the very concept of family through the spies program, systematically turning offspring into brainwashed informants. They have surgically destroyed the primal biological bond between parent and child. Private loyalties are systematically eradicated so that all devotion, all love, all fear is funneled directly upward to Big Brother. And what happens to the residual boiling human emotion, the repressed rage, the agonizing sexual frustration, the unspoken misery of a starved populace? The party does not ignore it, they expertly harvest it. Every single day, the citizens are subjected to the 2 minutes hate. It is a mandatory ritual, a psychological pressure valve designed by social engineers to redirect rotting internal agony into state-sanctioned communal hysteria. Winston stands in a room full of people screaming like animals at a flickering image of Emmanuel Goldstein, the great mythical enemy of the state. The hatred becomes a physical, vibrating entity, a toxic vapor filling the room. It is a terrifying display of engineered mass psychosis, providing the only sanctioned emotional release in their sterile, deadened lives. But it is within this screaming, chaotic frenzy that Winston's narrative takes a fatal turn. An inciting incident of ambiguous, incredibly dangerous connection. Across the room, amid the roaring, sweating crowd, Winston locks eyes with an inner party member. O'Brien. It is just a fleeting second, a microscopic shift in expression. Yet, in that silent gaze, Winston recognizes or desperately hallucinates a shared intellect, a mutual disgust for the shrieking mob surrounding them. It is an infinitesimal crack in the unyielding wall of the panopticon. That single silent exchange plants a desperate, fatal seed of hope within Winston's decaying mind. The myth of the brotherhood. The delusion that he might not be alone, the dangerous, intoxicating belief that somewhere, somehow, a resistance exists. But the resistance Winston so desperately seeks does not arrive in the form of a grand political conspiracy, nor does it begin with O'Brien. It arrives in a folded slip of paper, handed to him in a sterile corridor by a dark-haired girl from the fiction department, a girl wearing the scarlet sash of the Junior Anti-Sex League. Her name is Julia. When Winston finally unrolls that scrap of paper, expecting a political threat or an execution order, he reads 3 words that send a violent shockwave through his entire psychic architecture: I love you. Those 3 simple, terrifying words instantly transform Winston. His passive, cerebral, existential dread evaporates, replaced by an urgent, terrifying, and desperate will to live. Until this moment, his rebellion was purely philosophical, trapped inside his own decaying skull. Julia shifts the narrative focus of 1984 entirely. Her defiance is not abstract, it is visceral, it is bodily. Where Winston obsesses over systematic, institutional overthrow and the historical narrative, Julia engages in highly pragmatic, self-serving micro-rebellions. She procures real coffee, real sugar, real chocolate on the black market. She does not care about the ideological contradictions of the party. She cares about immediate sensory gratification. She is a creature of the earth, rebelling through the sheer, unadulterated assertion of her own biology against a sterile regime. George Orwell understood that totalitarian regimes must inevitably seek to police the libido. The party views the sex instinct as deeply dangerous, medius not for traditional moral reasons, but for strictly psychological ones. They seek to abolish the orgasm entirely, because uncontrollable physical ecstasy represents a sphere of energy, intimacy, and loyalty that exists completely outside the state's jurisdiction. To the party, pent-up sexual frustration is merely raw emotional fuel, easily redirected by social engineers into war fever and leader worship. Therefore, when Winston and Julia finally touch in the secrecy of the woods, tearing away the party's uniform, it is not merely a romance, it is a rebellion. As the narration explicitly observes, their embrace had been a battle, the climax a victory. It was a blow struck against the party. It was a political act. To escape the suffocating gaze of the omnipresent telescreens, they rent a secret sanctuary, a dilapidated, dusty room above Mr. Charrington's antique shop in the sprawling Prole district. Psychoanalytically, this room functions as a psychological womb, a fragile, enclosed, and tightly guarded space where Winston and Julia attempt to regress, desperately recreating a lost, bourgeois past, completely free from the relentless machinery of Oceania. Here, there are no uniforms. Here, there is a real bed, a ticking clock, and the intoxicating smell of roasting coffee. It is a physical manifestation of Winston's recurring golden country dreams, a subconscious yearning for an uncorrupted pastoral Eden that acts as a mental refuge against the suffocating, industrial rot of his waking life. Within this rented room, Winston purchases a piece of pink coral embedded in a dome of clear glass. This glass paperweight becomes one of the most potent symbols in Orwell's masterpiece. It is a poignant physical metaphor for Winston and Julia's relationship itself. It is a beautiful, frozen microcosm, existing entirely out of time, protected by a fragile dome that could be shattered at any given second. Winston literally stares into its curved depths, imagining that he and Julia are living inside it, suspended in a translucent world, the safe and untouched by the horror outside. But the tragic irony of their intimacy is that it is not inherently pure. Their love is not an organic, healthy bloom. It is deeply reactionary. It is defined entirely by its desperate opposition to the party's hatred. They cling to each other like drowning victims, their passion fueled by the constant, agonizing awareness that they are already dead. They know they will eventually be caught. They know there is no permanent escape from Big Brother. Yet, whoa, they continue the charade, building their fragile life inside the glass paperweight, willfully blind to the shadows closing in, and then the illusion of safety shatters. It happens in an instant of sheer, paralyzing terror, the comforting, familiar picture of Saint Mortal. Clement's church on the wall violently crashes to the floor, revealing the cold, metallic eye of a hidden telescreen directly behind it. The voice that speaks to them is metallic, authoritative, and utterly devoid of mercy. They are surrounded. The thought police shatter the door in a wave of black uniforms. Heavy boots thunder into their sacred womb. In the chaos of the violent, humiliating arrest, one of the men picks up the glass paperweight and casually smashes it against the hearth. The piece of pink coral rolls across the floor, suddenly small, ordinary, and completely meaningless. The fragile dome of their rebellion is annihilated. Their sanctuary is brutally severed. That insist, and as Winston looks at Julia's terrified, bruised face being dragged away, he realizes the devastating truth. They have not merely been caught, they have been watched the entire time. To realize you have been watched the entire time is to experience the utter collapse of reality, but the true architecture of betrayal runs much deeper than a hidden camera. It is the agonizing realization of who was doing the watching, the kindly, shuffling old man, Mr. Charrington, the man who sold Winston the diary, the man who provided the paperweight, steps into the light. The frail proprietor sheds his harmless demeanor like a cheap theatrical costume. His hair is no longer white, his wrinkles have vanished, his voice has completely changed, his posture is rigid, commanding. He is, and always was, an agent of the thought police. The illusion of the safe haven was never real. It was a trap, carefully constructed and baited, waiting patiently for the prey to walk blindly inside. The narrative tone of 1984 now shifts violently from a tense political thriller into claustrophobic, subterranean horror. Winston is dragged into the bowels of the Ministry of Love. There are no windows here. There is no day. There is no night. There is only the endless hum of ventilation machinery and the perpetual, timeless glare of artificial light. It is exactly as prophesied, the place where there is no darkness. In this white-tiled hell, the psychological disorientation is absolute. The creeping starvation, sudden beatings by masked guards, and severe sleep deprivation begin the methodical process of stripping away his humanity. But physical pain is merely the prologue. The true terror arrives with the opening of a heavy steel door. Winston looks up, hoping, desperately praying for his savior. Instead, he sees O'Brien, the intellectual, the supposed leader of the resistance, the man Winston believed he shared a secret psychic bond with. The psychological devastation of this unmasking is absolute, completely annihilating Winston's remaining grasp on sanity. O'Brien does not step into the cell as a fellow prisoner. He steps in as the Inquisitor. He is the architect of Winston's pain. O'Brien seamlessly transforms from imagined savior to ultimate torturer, revealing the most horrifying truth of George Orwell's dystopian vision. The state does not merely crush its enemies with brute force, it intimately understands them. It anticipates their rebellion, studies their psychology, and actively orchestrates their betrayal to guarantee their utter destruction. As O'Brien meticulously controls the dial of a pain-inducing machine, he discards the historical pretense that dictatorships commit atrocities for the greater good of the people. He strips away the ideological camouflage of Emmanuel Goldstein's manifesto, exposing the bleak mechanics of oligarchical collectivism. The perpetual war outside is merely an economic tool designed to destroy surplus wealth and freeze the social hierarchy forever. The inner party does not seek power as a means to a utopian end. Power is not a means, it is the absolute end. They do not want wealth or luxury. They want pure, unadulterated power over the human mind. O'Brien leans in, delivering a philosophical revelation so unvarnished in its sadism that it freezes the blood. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. The psychology of systemic torture in Oceania is profoundly different from the tyrannies of the past. The Inquisition killed heretics, but accidentally made martyrs of them. The party does not allow martyrs. O'Brien explains that his method is not merely to extract a false confession or a list of accomplices. The physical destruction of the body is entirely secondary. His true objective is to fundamentally rewire Winston's neural pathways, to wash his brain utterly clean of heterodoxy. The state demands that Winston be cured of his insanity before they execute him, ensuring that he dies with a mind completely empty of defiance, filled only with a hollow, absolute submission to the party's will. What follows is a dialectic of destruction. The interrogation scenes between these two men operate as a dark, twisted Socratic dialogue where the state's objective idealism utterly obliterates the individual's objective materialism. O'Brien holds up 4 fingers. He demands Winston say there are 5. Winston, clinging desperately to empirical evidence, refuses. The pain dial turns. A blinding, white-hot agony shatters Winston's body. The mathematical destruction of reality is absolute. O'Brien tells him softly, "Sometimes, Winston, sometimes they are 5, sometimes they are 3, sometimes they are all of them at once." Logic itself is systematically dismantled until the mind surrenders to whatever the party commands. Weeks, perhaps months pass. Time has lost all meaning in the windowless void. Winston is reduced to a skeletal, toothless, weeping shell of a man. He is physically broken, completely stripped of his dignity and his logic. He accepts that 2 + 2 makes 5. He accepts that his memory is flawed, that the party is eternal and infallible. Yet, despite being a shattered remnant of a human being, he clings desperately to one final, hidden internal bastion, a solitary ember glowing in the ash of his destroyed psyche. He has not betrayed his love for Julia.